When I opened my front door, my eyes landed on a manila envelope stuck to the inside of the glass. The words scrawled across it in bold letters made my stomach tighten. "Open now." My first instinct was Julia, maybe she sent it. But the handwriting was off. My pulse quickened as I tore it open, revealing a single printed photograph inside. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking it: Julia, sitting at a dimly lit bar, wearing a sleek black dress I'd never seen before. Her arm rested easily around the shoulders of a man who couldn't have been more than 10 years younger than her. His hand? Placed casually on her thigh. It felt like a punch to the gut. My mind scrambled for explanations. A mistake, a joke, something other than what it looked like. But when I turned the photo over, more writing stared back at me, the same messy scrawl as the envelope. "This isn't the first time. You deserve to know the truth." No signature. No further explanation. My head swam. Who sent this? How did they know where I lived? And the worst question of all, what exactly did they mean by "this isn't the first time"? I dropped the photo onto the counter and started pacing. My gut told me something had been off for months. Julia had been distant, secretive. Always coming home late, tossing out flimsy excuses about work meetings. But this? This was something else entirely. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. My stomach twisted as I looked at the photo again, trying to make sense of it. Then, the doorbell rang. My heart shot into my throat. I yanked the door open, half expecting to find Julia standing there. Instead, a delivery guy waited on my porch, a small box in his hands. "David Carter?" he asked, glancing at his clipboard. "That's me," I answered, my voice barely steady. Without another word, he handed me the package and walked off. I turned it over in my hands. No return address. Lighter than I expected. Right there in the doorway, I ripped it open. Inside was a flash drive. No note. No instructions. Just the drive. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop. One file. A video. The screen flickered to life, showing shaky footage of a hotel hallway. A few seconds in, she appeared, Julia. She was holding hands with the same guy from the photo, both of them laughing as they strolled toward a door. He slid a key into the lock, pushed it open, and together, they disappeared inside. The video ended. And with it, any lingering doubt I had. This wasn't paranoia. Wasn't a misunderstanding. Julia was cheating on me. But the real question was, who wanted me to know? And why? I stared at the screen, anger bubbling under my skin. Whoever sent this didn't just want to expose Julia. They wanted me to do something about it. I had no idea who was orchestrating this, but I wasn't about to sit back and let Julia unravel everything we had, not without answers. Whatever this was, I was in it now. The next morning, a loud knock on my door jolted me awake. I was still groggy, the previous night's anger simmering under the surface as I pulled myself up and opened the door. A man I'd never seen before stood there, tall, sharp, dressed in a gray suit, and carrying a leather briefcase. "Mr. Carter?" His tone was clipped, professional. "Yeah. Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and handed me a card. "Thomas Grant, attorney at law. I represent your wife, Julia," he said smoothly, his expression unreadable. "She's requested that all communication go through me from this point forward. I have some documents for you to review." His words hit like a hammer to the ribs. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay composed. "She didn't even have the decency to tell me herself?" I asked, my voice cold. He didn't so much as blink. "I'm just here to deliver the documents." From his briefcase, he pulled out a thick stack of papers. I took them, my eyes scanning the top page, divorce papers. She wasn't just serious, she was coming at me full force. I exhaled sharply and narrowed my eyes at the man standing before me. "Tell me something, Evan," I said, my voice edged with bitterness. "Does she know what's in this?" I held up the envelope, the one with the incriminating photo, letting the weight of it settle between us. For the first time, his polished mask cracked. His eyes flicked to the envelope, just for a second, before snapping back to me. A brief hesitation, but enough for me to notice. "What are you talking about?" he asked, forcing indifference into his tone. But I caught the slight tension in his voice. I tilted my head, studying him. "You're her lawyer, right? I assume she's been completely transparent with you. Or has she been selective with the truth?" I took a step closer, watching him squirm. "You might want to have a little chat with your client about her hotel rendezvous. I've got photos. I've got video." Evan shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the documents he was holding. I have no knowledge of that," he stammered. I let a grim smile tug at my lips. "Of course you don't." Then I leaned in just enough to make sure he heard every word. "Go ahead, confirm it with Julia. And while you're at it, tell her this: she doesn't get to torch my life and walk away without consequences." Before he could respond, I slammed the door in his face. My pulse thundered in my ears. My blood burned with rage. Julia had blindsided me. But now, her lawyer was the one off balance. I dropped into the chair at my dining table, staring at the thick stack of legal papers. The audacity of it all sent a tremor through my hands. She thought she could erase me, walk away like I was nothing. Not a chance. I flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that could give me an upper hand. Then I saw it. A clause about financial disclosure. Julia was legally required to provide a full report of her assets and liabilities. An idea took root in my mind, anger sharpening into cold determination. If she thought she could bulldoze me, she was about to realize just how wrong she was. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Detective Carter." "It's David Carter," I said. "I need your help. And I need it fast." Harris didn't miss a beat. "What's going on?" I glanced at the damning evidence sprawled across my table, the envelope, the flash drive, the divorce papers. Let's just say my wife has been keeping secrets. And I need someone who knows how to dig. As I hung up, something flickered inside me: control. Julia thought she had me backed into a corner. She had no idea. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I walked into Thomas Grant's law office at exactly 10 a.m., the agreed meeting time. The receptionist barely acknowledged me, waving vaguely toward a conference room. I stepped inside, pulse steady, but beneath the surface, I was a live wire, wound tight and ready. The room itself was dull: cream-colored walls, a polished table, leather chairs that tried too hard to look expensive. Evan was already there, seated with his briefcase open, papers neatly arranged in front of him. He looked up as I entered and forced a stiff smile. "Mr. Carter," he greeted, rising halfway from his chair to extend a handshake. I didn't take it. Instead, I stood at the edge of the table and met his gaze with quiet intensity. "Let's not waste time," I said, voice firm and unwavering. "I'm the husband." And that's when it happened. His outstretched hand froze midair. I watched as the realization dawned, draining the confidence from his face. In that single moment, the smooth, professional facade crumbled, and for just a heartbeat, pure panic flashed in his eyes. Evan slowly sank back into his chair, fingers tightening around the armrests as if bracing for impact. "So, you're the husband," he said, scrambling to recover. I leaned in slightly, a cold smile curving at the edges of my lips. "Yes," I said. "And judging by your reaction, I think we both know this isn't going the way Julia planned." Then, without breaking eye contact, I reached into my bag, pulled out a manila folder, and dropped it onto the table with a thud. I kept my gaze locked on Evan as I tapped the manila folder in front of him. "Inside here," I said evenly, "you'll find bank statements showing Julia transferring thousands of dollars to a man named Ryan Dawson. You'll also see hotel receipts and photos of the two of them together." His face drained of color. He stared at the folder like it might explode in his hands. "Mr. Carter," he stammered, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm not sure where you're going with this, but—" I didn't let him finish. My voice cut through the air like a blade. "Save it. Let me explain something to you, Evan." I leaned forward, my tone low and deliberate. "I'm not some clueless idiot Julia can manipulate. I know my rights. I know what she's done. And most importantly, I know how to play this game better than she ever could." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folder, flipping it open. I watched his jaw tighten with every page he scanned. "Does she know you have these?" he asked quietly, his earlier confidence now stripped away. "No," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But she'll find out soon enough." Silence filled the room, broken only by the soft rustling of papers as Evan turned the last page. Then, with a shaky exhale, he closed the folder and rubbed his temple. "Mr. Carter," he began cautiously, "as her legal representative, I have to advise you that—" I cut him off again. "Spare me the legal spiel. Here's what's going to happen." My voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of certainty. "You're going to go back to Julia and tell her this: I'm not agreeing to a damn thing until there's full disclosure of her assets and liabilities. And if she thinks she can push this divorce through without addressing her infidelity and financial misconduct, I'll make sure the court sees every last piece of evidence I have." Evan opened his mouth, but I raised a hand to stop him. "And one more thing," I added, lowering my voice, letting every word sink in. "Tell her this isn't just about the divorce. This is about consequences. About her learning that she can't treat people like trash and just walk away untouched." I stood, slinging my bag over my shoulder, and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, I glanced back at Evan. He looked like he'd just been hit by a freight train. "Oh, and Evan?" I said, my voice carrying just a hint of amusement. "You might want to rethink your strategy. Because right now, you're representing someone who's about to lose everything. And if you're not careful, she'll take you down with her." I didn't wait for his response. As I walked out of that office and into the crisp afternoon air, something settled inside me. This wasn't just about exposing Julia anymore. This was about taking back control of my life. And this? This was just the beginning. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. By the time I got home, my phone was already vibrating non-stop. 3 missed calls from Julia. As I unlocked the screen, a text popped up. "We need to talk. Call me now." I smirked, tossed the phone onto the counter, and grabbed a drink from the fridge. Let her wait. She was so used to pulling the strings, controlling every situation to her advantage. But now? The puppet show was over. An hour later, the doorbell rang. I took my time answering. When I finally pulled the door open, Julia stood there, arms crossed, eyes blazing with anger. She was dressed like she had just walked out of a high-powered boardroom, sleek blouse, fitted designer skirt, heels clicking against my floor as she stormed inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk," she snapped, spinning around to face me. I shut the door slowly. Deliberately. "I figured you'd show up eventually," I said, leaning casually against the wall. "What's the emergency, Julia? Did your boyfriend dump you already?" A flicker of guilt flashed across her face, but she buried it quickly beneath her usual mask of indignation. "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, David," she shot back, her voice dripping with fury. "Dragging my lawyer into this? Sending him those lies? That's low, even for you." "Lies?" I barked out a short, humorless laugh. "You're really going to stand there and deny it?" My tone was eerily calm, controlled. "The bank transfers? The hotel stays? The video? None of it's real?" I took a slow step forward, watching her closely. "Do you want me to show you the evidence right now, Julia?" I asked, voice smooth as steel. "Or would you prefer I save it for court?" For a brief second, her mask slipped. But then, just as quickly, she forced it back into place, her expression hardening. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," she snapped. "Jake is just a friend. Those transfers? Loans. And the hotel? We were meeting with clients. It's not what it looks like." I let out a sharp, bitter laugh, loud enough that she flinched. "Clients?" I echoed, my voice dripping with disbelief. "That's your excuse? Do you think I'm an idiot, or do you just get some kind of sick pleasure out of insulting my intelligence?" And there it was. The first real crack in her armor. She wasn't used to being cornered. And it showed. "Fine," she snapped, throwing up her hands. "You want the truth? Yes, I've been seeing Jake. But can you really blame me?" Her voice rose, thick with self-righteousness. "You've been so checked out, so wrapped up in your work, that you didn't even notice how miserable I've been for years." I scoffed, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Miserable?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean while living in the house I paid for? Spending the money I earned? Enjoying the life I built for us? That kind of miserable?" Her jaw tightened, lips pressing into a thin, stubborn line. She looked away, as if she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. "You don't understand, David. You never did." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a low, controlled growl. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. "I understand that you're a liar, a cheat, and a coward. And now you're trying to make yourself the victim because you got caught." Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think you're so righteous," she hissed. "But let's not pretend you're perfect, David. You've made mistakes too." "Maybe I have," I said, keeping my tone even despite the storm raging inside me. "But I never betrayed you. I never broke the vows we made." For a long, tense moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, heavy, filled with years of resentment, of unspoken words, of a relationship that had been dead long before today. Finally, Julia let out a slow, dramatic sigh and grabbed her purse. "You want to fight?" she said, lifting her chin. "Fine." Her voice was calmer now, controlled, but there was something cold behind her eyes. Something calculating. "But just remember, David, you're not the only one with a few tricks up your sleeve." She spun on her heel and marched out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, my hands clenched into fists. Her parting words weren't just a threat. They were a declaration of war. And if Julia wanted a war, she was about to find out what happens when you push the wrong man too far. The next morning, chaos greeted me the moment I opened my eyes. My phone buzzed non-stop, lighting up with notifications, one after another, a relentless flood of emails, missed calls, and messages. Some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Frowning, I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the barrage of texts. "Hey David, is everything okay, man? I just heard the rumors. What's going on with you and Julia? Saw the post. Call me if you need anything. A cold chill crept up my spine. I opened the next message. It contained a screenshot. And the moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. Julia. She had beaten me to the punch. Her social media account was now plastered with a carefully curated post, complete with well-chosen photos of her looking distraught and a caption designed to turn heads. Sometimes, you realize you've been trapped in a loveless, suffocating marriage with someone who doesn't care about your happiness. I deserve better, and I'm finally standing up for myself. To those who judge me, you don't know the full story. The comments section was a circus of pity and outrage. People were eating it up, lining up to stroke her ego and flood her with sympathy. I scrolled further, my grip tightening around my phone. Friends. Acquaintances. People who barely knew us, suddenly playing judge and jury, spewing opinions about my life like they had a clue. And just like that, I saw her game. This wasn't just damage control. This was Julia rewriting the narrative. Turning herself into the victim before I even had a chance to tell the truth. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to think. Reacting in anger would only play into her hands. And I wasn't about to let her win. Not this time. If I wanted to counter Julia's stunt, I had to be smart. No knee-jerk reactions. No reckless moves. The first step? Call Harris. He picked up on the second ring. Harris, I said, my voice steady. It's time to take things to the next level. Good timing, he replied. I've been digging into something you'll want to see. An hour later, I was sitting across from him in a small, no-frills office. Harris slid a folder across the desk, a sly grin tugging at his lips. Julia's been busy, he said, flipping it open. Stacks of documents. Photographs. Proof. I traced the bank transfers you showed me, he continued. Turns out, Ryan Dawson isn't just her boyfriend, he's also been funneling money from your joint account into an offshore account. The guy's a grifter. Plain and simple. I stared at the evidence, feeling the pieces snap into place. Julia wasn't just cheating. She was funding this guy's lifestyle with my money. Harris leaned back, arms crossed. His voice was casual, but the weight of what he was saying was anything but. And it gets better, he added. I pulled records on Jake. He's got a history of scamming women like Julia. Wines and dines them, drains their accounts, then vanishes once they're broke. The anger that had been simmering inside me ignited into something hotter. Julia had betrayed me. Lied to me. And now she was playing the victim, while getting conned herself. I clenched my jaw. What's the next move? Harris studied me. Depends on how public you want to go. We could file a police report, press fraud charges, and subpoena financial records to prove she's complicit. It won't be pretty, though. The fallout will be brutal. I met his gaze, unwavering. Messy is fine. I exhaled slowly. She declared war, Harris. I'm just making sure she understands the cost. I walked out of that office with the folder tucked under my arm and a plan forming in my head. Julia thought she could control the narrative. She thought she could rewrite reality to suit her needs. But she was about to learn a hard lesson. Lies don't survive scrutiny. That evening, I sat at my desk, staring at my laptop screen. I wasn't going to rant. I wasn't going to sling mud. I was going to drop cold, hard facts. I wrote my statement carefully, calculated, precise. Just enough evidence to counter Julia's lies, but not enough to show my full hand. Before posting, I hesitated for a brief moment, my finger hovering over the button. Then, I hit publish. And just like that, the truth was out. The reaction was immediate. The comments section under Julia's post, once filled with blind sympathy, began shifting. People started asking questions. calling her out, challenging her story. Doubt spread like wildfire. My phone buzzed non-stop. Friends, acquaintances, even people I barely knew were reaching out. Most were shocked by the evidence. Some were apologetic for believing Julia's version of events in the first place. Julia had always been a master manipulator, always good at spinning a story. But this time, facts spoke louder than her fiction. And the silence from her side? Deafening. At least until the next morning. I was in the middle of a call with Harris when my phone lit up with a notification. She posted something else, Harris said before I could even ask. I clicked on the link and there it was. Another carefully curated sob story, another strategic move. This time, she had a new angle, a photo of herself looking distraught, accompanied by a desperate, self-righteous caption. To those spreading lies about me, you don't know the full story. Some people will do anything to tear others down, but I refuse to stoop to their level. I'll let the truth come out in court. I exhaled slowly, gripping my phone a little tighter. She was doubling down. Doubling down on the lie. She wasn't just trying to control the narrative anymore. She was buying time. She was stalling, because she knew what was coming next. And this time? I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I almost laughed. Julia was still clinging to the hope that she could salvage her image. But it was over. The cracks in her carefully constructed facade were too deep now. And people weren't buying it anymore. Not long after, my phone rang. Evan. I answered, already knowing where this was going. Mr. Carter, he started, his voice noticeably strained. I think we need to discuss the situation before it escalates further. I let out a cold chuckle. Oh, it's escalated plenty already, I said, my tone icy. Unless you're calling to tell me your client is ready to come clean and make this easy, we don't have much to discuss. A pause. Then a sigh. She's willing to negotiate, Evan said reluctantly. Negotiate? I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping. She doesn't get to negotiate after what she's done. I have everything I need to bury her in court, Evan. This is her one chance to walk away with whatever dignity she has left. Silence stretched between us. Finally, Evan spoke again. If we meet in person, perhaps we can come to an agreement. I considered it. The thought of seeing Julia after everything made my blood boil. But this? This was an opportunity. To tighten the noose. Fine, I said. Set it up. 2 days later, I walked into Evan's office again. This time, Julia was already there, seated at the conference table. She looked different. Tired. Her usual confidence, the arrogance, the carefully composed smirk, was gone. Instead, something closer to desperation sat in its place. She didn't even look at me as I took my seat across from her. Evan cleared his throat, attempting to ease the tension. Let's keep this civil, he began. I cut him off immediately. We're past civil, Evan. Let's talk about how this ends. Julia finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. You've made your point, David. You've humiliated me, dragged my name through the mud. No, I interrupted, leaning forward. You did that to yourself. All I did was show people the truth. Don't you dare try to pin this on me. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Evan shifted in his seat, flipping through some papers, launching into some legal jargon about settlements. I barely heard him. My focus was locked on Julia, watching her squirm under the weight of her own lies. Then, I dropped the bombshell. I know about Jake's offshore account, I said, my voice calm but razor-sharp. I know exactly how much money you funneled to him. And I know his history. I tilted my head, watching the blood drain from her face. Do you really think the court is going to look kindly on that, Julia? You haven't just cheated. You've committed fraud. And I have everything I need to prove it. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. David. You don't have to do this, she said. We can fix this. Let's just end things quietly and move on. I shook my head. You think this is about revenge? I asked. It's not. This is about accountability. I leaned back, voice steady. You lied. You cheated. And you stole from me. The days of you walking away unscathed? They're over. Evan quickly intervened, trying to regain control of the meeting. Perhaps we should reconvene and discuss terms. No. I stood up, my decision final. We're done here, I said. Tell your client to prepare for court. And then I walked out. No anger. No second guessing. Just absolute clarity. Julia had wanted a fight. Now she had one. And this time, I wasn't going to lose. The courtroom showdown. The courtroom was packed when the hearing began. Julia sat at the defendant's table, Evan beside her. Her face was pale but defiant. Still clinging to the last shreds of her composure. But I could see it, the nervous glances, the tight grip on her pen, the way she barely moved. She knew. She knew this wasn't going to end well. But her pride wouldn't let her show weakness. I sat across from her, my lawyer, Emily, by my side. Emily was sharp, relentless, and exactly the kind of ally I needed. She had meticulously prepared for this moment, and it showed in the quiet confidence she carried. The judge called the session to order. And the proceedings began. Evan was the first to speak, doing his best to downplay Julia's actions as nothing more than irreconcilable differences, an unfortunate case of two people growing apart. It was the kind of generic legal jargon designed to soften the reality of what had happened. But Emily wasn't having it. When it was her turn, she stood smoothly, exuding confidence as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady but firm. This is not a case of irreconcilable differences. This is a case of betrayal, financial misconduct, and deception. My client has provided substantial evidence proving that Mrs. Carter engaged in an extramarital affair, misappropriated joint funds, and attempted to manipulate these proceedings to her advantage. She walked to the evidence table and picked up the thick folder Harris had prepared. Holding it up for the courtroom to see, she continued. These bank statements clearly show Mrs. Carter transferring tens of thousands of dollars to Ryan Dawson, a known fraudster with a documented history of exploiting women for financial gain. These funds were withdrawn from jointly held accounts without my client's knowledge or consent. Evan immediately objected, claiming the transfers were loans, but Emily was ready. Without missing a beat, she pulled out screenshots of Jake's offshore account and records that directly linked the transactions to Julia. Loans, she repeated, arching a brow. Then perhaps Mrs. Carter can explain why those loans ended up in an offshore account under Mr. Dawson's name? The courtroom was silent except for the shuffling of papers. Emily pressed on, her voice unwavering. And if that weren't enough, she continued, we have photographic and video evidence of Mrs. Carter engaging in behavior that leaves no question about the nature of her relationship with Mr. Patterson. This is not about financial help, Your Honor. This is about a deliberate pattern of deception, infidelity, and the misuse of marital assets. Julia shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Her confidence was cracking, the weight of the evidence pressing down on her with every passing second. The judge turned to Evan, expression unreadable. Mr. Grant, do you have a response to these claims? Evan stood slowly, clearly rattled but trying to maintain composure. Your Honor, he started carefully, while we acknowledge that mistakes were made, we believe these allegations are being exaggerated. Mrs. Carter was under extreme emotional distress and made choices that, while regrettable, were not made with malicious intent. Emily scoffed audibly, shaking her head in disbelief. Regrettable decisions, she shot back, incredulous. Misappropriating marital funds and engaging in a long-term affair aren't regrettable decisions. They're deliberate actions that caused my client significant harm, both emotionally and financially. The judge raised a hand, silencing the exchange before it escalated further. Then, he turned his attention to me. "Mr. Carter, would you like to speak?" I took a breath and stood, locking eyes with Julia. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was just done. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, "for years, I supported Julia. Financially, emotionally, in every way a husband should. I built a life for us, and I trusted her completely. That trust was shattered when I discovered the truth. Not only was she unfaithful, but she used our shared finances to fund her affair. This isn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it's a betrayal of every promise she ever made to me." Julia shifted in her seat, opening her mouth to respond, but the judge cut her off with a sharp look. He turned to her. "Mrs. Carter," he said, voice firm, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Julia hesitated. For the first time since this started, she looked small. Her hands gripped the table like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky but defiant. "Your Honor, I made mistakes," she said, swallowing hard. But David wasn't perfect either. He was distant. He buried himself in work. I felt invisible. And Jake, he made me feel seen. Her words hung in the air, waiting for sympathy that never came. The courtroom was silent. Even Evan shifted uncomfortably beside her. The judge exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Mrs. Carter, feeling neglected does not excuse theft or deceit. The evidence against you is substantial, and it paints a clear picture of deliberate wrongdoing." Julia's eyes darkened, but she said nothing. The judge called for a recess, his expression making it clear that this wasn't going in her favor. As I stood, preparing to walk out of the courtroom, I could feel Julia's eyes on me. Her stare burned into my back. She wasn't defeated yet. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But no matter what she did next, it wouldn't change the truth. And truth, unlike lies, doesn't crumble under pressure. The weight of her actions was finally starting to catch up with her. And I was just getting started. The aftermath of the court session. The fallout from the court hearing unfolded like a brewing storm. But Julia's silence wasn't a retreat. It was the eerily calculated calm before her next move. I knew her too well. When she felt cornered, she didn't break. She lashed out. What I didn't expect was how far she'd go this time. 2 days later, I got a call from Harris. His voice was more serious than usual. "David, we've got a situation. You need to see this." A moment later, a video link popped up in my messages. I clicked it. A local news broadcast. And there she was, Julia, standing outside the courthouse, tears streaming down her face as she spoke into a microphone. "I'm just trying to move on and rebuild my life," she said, her voice trembling. "But my husband is dragging me through the mud. He's weaponizing our personal issues to destroy me, and now I'm receiving threats because of his lies. I'm afraid for my safety." My jaw clenched so tight I felt my teeth grind. She wasn't just doubling down. She was playing the victim again, painting me as a vindictive abuser, feeding off public sympathy, twisting reality to suit her narrative. The comments section was a war zone. Some people were eating it up, sending their support. Others were starting to question the cracks in her story. But one thing was clear, Julia wasn't done fighting. The ultimate betrayal. That evening, Harris called again. His tone was sharper this time, carrying an edge of satisfaction. "I've been keeping tabs on Ryan Dawson." I exhaled. "What now?" "Jake skipped town." I sat up. "What?" "Word is he caught wind of the court hearing and decided to bail before things got too hot. But before he left, he cashed out most of the offshore account Julia was funneling money into." The room went still. I processed the words slowly, piece by piece. "Julia's broke." I let out a low, humorless laugh. "She doesn't know yet, does she?" "Not yet," Harris confirmed. "But her golden boy just burned her." And suddenly, the full weight of the irony hit me like a freight train. Julia had betrayed me for a con man. And now, he had done to her exactly what she helped him do to me. But instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt something else. An opportunity. I straightened in my chair. "Can we prove it?" "Absolutely," Harris said. "We've got the transaction records. It's airtight." I felt a slow, cold determination settle over me. Time for the final blow. The final blow. The next day, Emily and I sat in her office, going over our next move. I leaned forward, tapping my fingers on the desk. "We need to make this public. Julia's trying to control the narrative, but if we expose what Jake did, her whole house of cards collapses." Emily nodded, already typing away. "We'll need to release this strategically. Let the evidence do the talking. No emotion, no drama. Just cold, hard facts." By the end of the day, we had everything ready. Emily reached out to a trusted investigative journalist, someone who had built a reputation for uncovering financial scandals and fraud. Within hours, the story went live. Headline: Local woman's affair ends in financial ruin, exclusive evidence unveiled. The article pulled no punches. It exposed Julia's transfers to Jake, laid out his history of scamming women, and revealed his recent disappearance with the stolen money. Screenshots of the bank records. Proof of the offshore transactions. There was no room for doubt anymore. Julia's world falls apart. The fallout was immediate. Social media exploded. People who had once defended Julia turned on her. The same friends who had flooded her courthouse video with support now filled her comments section with betrayal and disgust. "How could you lie like this? So you were using your husband's money the whole time? You ruined your own life and now you're playing the victim? Disgusting. Her perfectly curated narrative? Shattered." And then, my phone rang. I checked the screen. Julia. For the first time in weeks, she sounded genuinely panicked. "David, we need to talk." Her voice shook. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Oh, now you want to talk?" I said coldly. "What happened to only communicating through my lawyer?" The final call. "Please," Julia begged, her voice raw with desperation. "I didn't know Jake was going to do this. I need help." I let out a cold, bitter laugh. "Help?" I repeated, shaking my head. "You're kidding, right? After everything you've done, you actually expect me to bail you out?" Her breath hitched. "David," she pleaded, her voice rising. "If you don't help me, I'll lose everything." I exhaled slowly, letting my next words sink in. "You already have." A heavy silence filled the space between us. "And you brought it on yourself." Before she could respond, I ended the call. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. Julia's lies had finally caught up with her. And the best part? I didn't need to lift a finger. Her own choices had done all the work for me. The final court decision. A few days after Julia's desperate call, I received a notification from Emily. The court had set a final date for the divorce proceedings. At this point, there was no doubt, Julia's strategy of smearing me publicly had backfired spectacularly. The news story about Jake's con had turned the tide completely. She was isolated. Scrambling. And when the day finally arrived, I walked into the courtroom feeling calm. Even confident. Julia, on the other hand, looked like a shadow of the woman I used to know. Her once impeccable appearance was frayed, dark circles under her eyes, hands trembling as she fidgeted with a pen. She had spent so much time playing the victim. Now, she actually was one, of her own recklessness. The hearing was swift. The judge, already well aware of the mountains of evidence we had submitted, wasted no time cutting through the noise. Julia's attempts to defend her actions were weak and unconvincing. Her voice wavered as she tried to justify the bank transfers and her affair. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said sternly, "your behavior not only violated the trust inherent in your marriage but also involved financial misconduct that cannot be overlooked. Given the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of Mr. Carter." The gavel struck. And just like that, it was over. The judge granted me the larger share of our marital assets and ordered Julia to pay restitution for the funds she had misappropriated. Her face crumbled as the full weight of her situation settled on her. But the real blow came after the hearing. As I was gathering my things, Evan approached me. He looked exhausted, his usual smugness completely gone. "Mr. Carter," he began cautiously. "Off the record, I have to say, I didn't know the full extent of what Julia had done when I took this case. If I had..." I raised a hand, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter now, Evan. Just make sure your next client doesn't drag you down with them." He hesitated, then nodded, relief flickering in his eyes as he turned to leave. The final goodbye. As I stepped out of the courtroom, Julia was waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Her arms were crossed, her posture stiff, but when she looked up at me, her expression was a tangled mix of anger and desperation. "Are you happy now?" she snapped. "You've ruined me, David. Was that your plan all along?" I stopped in front of her, my face calm. "No, Julia," I said evenly. "My plan was to protect myself and expose the truth. You ruined yourself when you lied, cheated, and thought you could walk away without consequences." She opened her mouth to retort, but something in my expression stopped her. Her shoulders slumped. For the first time in a long time, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Regret. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, unsteady. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." I nodded, my tone firm but not unkind. "But it did." I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "And now we both have to live with the choices we made." She didn't say another word. She just watched as I walked past her. With every step I took, the weight of the past lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not just from Julia, but from the anger, the betrayal, and the war that had consumed me for so long. And that was worth more than anything she had ever taken from me. The end of one chapter. As I reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, Emily was waiting by her car. She smiled as I approached, her expression warm and triumphant. "It's over," she said simply. I glanced up at the sky, clear, open, full of possibilities. "No," I replied. "It's just beginning." And with that, I got into my car and drove away. Ready to rebuild. This time, on my own terms. Moving forward. The days following the final hearing were a whirlwind of emotions, relief, vindication, and an odd sense of emptiness all tangled together. For so long, my life had revolved around Julia's betrayal, the fight to expose the truth, the battle to reclaim what was mine. Now that it was over, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But one thing was certain. The peace that came with her absence was undeniable. No more manipulative phone calls. No more public stunts to smear my name. Julia had vanished into the shadows, her reputation in ruins, her financial situation worse than ever. Jake's betrayal had left her completely exposed, and the people who once rallied behind her now avoided her like the plague. One morning, as I sipped coffee in my now quiet, empty home, my laptop pinged with a new email. I glanced at the sender. Julia. The subject line read simply. Closure. I hesitated. Then, against my better judgment, I clicked it open. The message was long, rambling, full of apologies that felt half-hearted at best. She claimed she never meant to hurt me, that she got caught up in her own unhappiness and made terrible decisions. She blamed Jake, painting herself as another one of his victims. But there was no accountability. No real acknowledgement of what she had done. Just another attempt to rewrite the narrative in her favor. I didn't reply. I didn't even think about replying. There was no point. Julia's words didn't matter anymore. She had become nothing more than a chapter in my life, a painful one, yes, but one that was finally closed. Rebuilding. Instead, I focused on what actually mattered. I threw myself into my work, rediscovering a part of myself that had been buried under all the chaos. My colleagues, who had stood by me through it all, welcomed me back like nothing had changed. And in a way, everything had changed, but for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my life again. I also started reaching out to old friends, the people I had unintentionally distanced myself from during my marriage. People who actually cared. One evening, I met up with Harris at a quiet bar, the kind of place where you could actually talk without shouting over music. I raised my glass. You did good, Harris. I couldn't have done it without you. He smirked. You gave me a hell of a case to work on. Watching Julia's lies crumble in that courtroom? Worth every second. We laughed, but as the conversation went on, his expression turned thoughtful. He leaned in slightly. So, what's next for you, David? Now that this is all behind you? It was a question I hadn't fully considered. For months, my focus had been on survival, on fighting back, protecting what was mine. Now, I had the chance to start fresh. I took a slow sip of my drink, then exhaled. I want to rebuild. Not just my life, but myself. Julia took a lot from me, but she didn't break me. I'm still standing. And I'm not going to waste this second chance. Harris nodded, lifting his glass. To second chances, then. We clinked glasses. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Julia may have tried to destroy me. But in the process, she had taught me something invaluable. I wasn't just a survivor. I was stronger than I had ever realized. And with that strength, I was ready to step into the next chapter of my life. Leaving her, and all the chaos she brought, far behind me.